You don't like the end? Well, I'll sit on the end if you're gonna have all that hissy fit about it.
I didn't.
You were having a hissy fit. You were having a total hissy fit.
If Maggie comes, she wants to sit by me.
Oh, you want to sit by the girls. I feel totally neglected. I've been thrown away. All the girls are sitting together.
You got one Eve always here.
It's like what was the Little Rascals, when they had the female woman haters club. And then Darla came and she captivated Alfalfa. So she was finally nominated to the female woman haters club. That's a great Little Rascals. I took some cheap pins. They seem to always people lifting the pins. You think, as wealthy as the people that come to that church, that they wouldn't steal something as minuscule as a 10-cent pin.
People do that all the time and come just with
No.
pins. Pins grow legs.
Well, yeah, but it amazes me. I can understand because they're their poor church. I'm sorry, that's what I feel. All right, I want you to read everything. Then that you're an expert in the Hebrew language.
By no means an expert.
It's raining hard again.
Wow.
Means
Got it in time.
means your car will get a nice wash.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I wanted to do it.
Wow, thank you, Lord.
Yeah, but they kept saying, oh, it's gonna be scattered thunder showers, maybe about 12 o'clock. Remember that, Matt Barentine, the one last night? I looked at it, I said, take off my chateau. Yeah, I found this somewhere, and it was $10. It was a great buy. Take a look at it. And it's made in China, do not wash. So I have it. And do not wash it. How you keep it clean and dishes. Got it like that. Anyway, I don't wear it enough to get dirt much dirty either.
I ate too fast.
You broken?
Now my stomach is not feel good.
Well, I'm sorry.
Not your fault.
You always eat faster than I do.
Yes.
You really do.
That was so good.
You always eat faster. And Judy was so slow. I could finish 4 meals by the time she got through with one dish. I've never seen anybody eat as slow as she did. You eat diametrically opposed. Judy could eat 1 meal, you could eat 10. That's really neat, that skylight.
Mm-hmm.
This is an architectural gem.
It's beautiful.
It's an architectural gem.
Mm-hmm.
Builders were really gifted.
What?
I said the builders were
Oh,
really
they are
gifted.
here.
Hi,
Hi.
how are you?
Hi.
How are you, sir?
I'm good, how are you?
Upright.
Good to see you.
Hi, how are you? Ashley,
This is Justin Ashford, and this is Lucinda.
Justin, good to see you.
Nice to
Okay.
meet you, Dustin.
Justin.
I love your shoes, those are nice.
Yeah.
I'm talking about his and yours. both.
Oh, thank you, yeah.
Zapatos is the Spanish word.
Are you the visiting it
Yes.
last week?
Yeah.
Good, it's good to
Oh,
see you.
good.
You're the welder?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Well,
Yeah, I work for Ingalls.
do you work for Ingalls?
Yeah.
Then how long you been working for them?
2 years now.
Enjoy your job?
It's pretty good. Yeah.
Yeah, welders have to be precise. People don't realize how
Yeah.
precise a job welding has to be to get correct weld.
Yeah.
I saw a whole thing on it one time, and I worked with, when I worked with the Corps of Engineers, we had some jobs with welds that were bad.
Yeah.
And so I came to appreciate good welders.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's just a shortage of them right now, so they're working us pretty hard.
Are they?
Yeah.
Did you or did you, open up any of the previous, Sunday things?
No, how many were there before this one?
A bunch.
A bunch.
Oh, were there?
Let's see, it started
Before, around before Christmas.
November the 17th.
Yeah, that was the first one.
Yeah, he has really done a wonderful job.
Yeah.
He's a great guy.
I came here and I did some Shabbats and stuff like that last year, but it's just tough because
You got a lot on your plate, don't you?
yeah, a lot of driving after work. It's exhausting. It's really
I can understand.
yeah.
But the rabbi is a very fascinating man and very interesting when he lectures.
Yeah.
Sometimes I get lost though, when he goes into Hebrew.
Oh yeah.
Are you Jewish?
Well, my dad is, and my mom's not, so technically no. But I grew up Christian. My mom's Christian,
Yeah.
and so yeah, I'm trying to learn, a little bit about the
Judaism.
Jew. Yeah.
Yeah, we're Christian.
But we all have a common God.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the respect for that common God is what keeps us together.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the weatherman messed it up. Scattered showers. They'd scattered all over us. Where do you live? Over near Pascagoula?
Yeah. It was really bad when I took off about 2 hours ago. I came here, I got something to eat, and then I came here. But
That's been a heavy rain.
yeah, it was heavy rain down there when I left.
And of course, the interstate is such wonderful drivers,
Yeah.
trying to kill you. I'm gonna get there. Yeah, I saw a sign one time on the back of a car, it says, "Drive like hell, you'll get there soon." I thought, well, that's probably appropriate for some of these people.
Yeah. Yeah, it's supposed to be pretty much raining for the next 10 days or something like that, it says.
Mm-hmm.
It's gonna be gloomy. It feels later in the day right now.
It does.
Even though the time's changed.
Yeah.
And tomorrow's supposed to be stormy, is what they said, but who knows? This is pretty stormy in and of itself.
Yeah.
I was commenting to her that this is just a wonderful piece of architecture.
Yeah.
I just love it. The builders had a real vision when they built it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The woodwork is beautiful in this building.
Yeah, but it's not Frank Lloyd Wright, but it takes a lot from him.
I wonder who designed it.
I don't know.
Do you know?
Do you remember who designed this, Rabbi?
What's that?
Who designed this church?
I think Harvey Gandler was the architect.
Oh, he did a fabulous.
He's a member, still alive, still.
Is he?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it is.
I need to quiz him on who he drew from architecturally.
His inspiration.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think
Has a little bit of Frank Lloyd Wright in here. I
it does
swear.
have a little bit of that, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It sure does. Okay.
Is Maggie at home today?
Yeah, she left at 11:30. she's still getting over some of these migraines and some of the after effects of the new drug that they put into her.
And I'm sure the weather's not helping.
What's that?
I'm sure the weather's.
And the weather, exactly, the weather isn't helping at all. How's everybody? Thank you so much for coming, and certainly appreciate. This is part 2 of Passover, and
Is it Pesach?
what's that?
How do you say it, Pesach?
Pesach.
Pesach.
Yeah, with a cha, that kind of sort
I
of
have
guttural
my throat, yeah.
sound that we don't have. It's very close to the sound in German, the ch of like ich or dich, you know, in German. But this is more of a guttural. This is more from the throat. Pesach.
Pesach.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
I'll get that
Okay.
right. I remembered it, I just couldn't pronounce it.
Yep. Oh, no problem. So, we want to continue looking at some of the major themes and some themes that are not, that are often not thought about in the Haggadah. The Haggadah has 2 purposes to it. One is, as we said last week, the Haggadah Talavincha, you shall tell your children. I mean, that's in the Torah. But what is in the oral tradition, what is in the Talmud and in the rabbinic tradition is that, well, suppose you don't have any children. Suppose you don't have any children, then, or you don't have any grandchildren, obviously. Then the mitzvah is to tell it to your students, to tell it to anyone that you can. If you're sitting just with your wife, if it's just your partner, you should still have the Seder. Even if you're all alone and you're a Talmid Chacham, you're a sage, you know the story, you know the ins and outs of Passover, you know to do all the things that are required regarding ridding the home of the chametz. Nevertheless, you should still tell of the going out of Egypt. And the more, and this is what Maimonides says as well as what's in the Haggadah, and the more that one does this, the more that one elaborates on the story of the Exodus, Hareza Mishabach, surely this is praiseworthy. In other words, it is something that is to be admired. It's not just enough to speak of the Torah-itic requirement, the strict Torah-itic requirement, and translate the Torah in a strict halachic way. Instead, you look also to the underlying function, the underlying purpose, which is in the traditional scheme, is the acknowledgement of God as the primary mover, borrow Aristotle for just a second, the primary mover in the Exodus narrative. You have the 10 plagues. You notice that Moses is, I don't believe, Moses is maybe mentioned in one place, but all of it, all of the actions of the Exodus, which is what the Haggadah talks about, is directed towards God. The Jewish people see the hand of God in the Exodus narrative, and the Haggadah makes that very clear. With that, last time we covered the 3 most important aspects of the Seder. There's 3 things that you must mention in order to fulfill the obligation, and that is the Pesach, the Matzah, and the Maror, right? So, the other thing that is often not mentioned is after you finish with the Halach Ma'anya, and we'll go back to that for a second.
I had a question.
Yes, please.
Haggadah, that's the Passover in English? What is the Haggadah?
The Haggadah is a good question. The Haggadah is a technical term. Okay, it comes from the word higid, which is to tell.
Uh, 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 uh,
that you have, that you use at the Seder table to tell of the going out of Egypt. That's the technical meaning. It comes from the root to tell, okay? Lahagid, to tell. So Haggadah, you can hear, is the telling, so to speak, or not really the telling, but telling. And here you have the telling of the Passover.
Are
Okay.
there kadanas for other things, like the?
What's that?
Are there kadanas for other things, like the telling of going into Israel or traveling in the desert?
That's a good question. It's another good question. It's a little bit off the topic, but the Haggadah is only, that term is only used for Passover. For example, there is the Megillat Esther, or the Megillah. During Purim, you read from a scroll that is called the Megillat Esther, the scroll of Esther. When you refer to the Megillah, in most instances, you're referring to the scroll of Esther. I mean, that's what you're really talking about. Even though there's 5 other scrolls that are designated as part of Ketuvim, like the Book of Daniel, the Book of Ruth. They're called the 5 Megillot, but most people in the common language, when they talk about the Megillah, the first thing that they refer to is the story of Purim. But that's the only other scroll that I can think of at the moment where you have this sort of one word really means this, and the same thing with Haggadah. There's only, you wouldn't use Haggadah in any other context. Okay, good, yeah, okay. Now, this Haggadah kind of goes a little bit out of the traditional order, and that is, of course, absolutely fine. You get right to the questions, and then you get them. I wanted to skip that. I want to go to page 36. Once again, this presentation is in terms of some of the hidden things of Passover that often get overlooked. So if you go to the top of the page, and if you operate from the assumption that when the Haggadah was put together, you didn't have freedom of writing. If you just work from that assumption for a moment, freedom of speech is in terms of history, is a relatively new concept. And there is a scholar, I don't think he's alive anymore, and now I'm blocking his name, and Arthur, God, what's his last name? He was an economist out of University of Chicago.
Schlesinger?
What's that?
Was it Schlesinger?
Say it louder, please.
Schlesinger?
No, good guess. He wrote a book or an essay called, or kind of a monograph called Art and the Persecution of Writing, I think is the name of it. Very famous economist.
I know who you're talking about.
What's that?
I know who you're talking
Sure.
about.
And he posits as a theory that books prior to, freedom of speech, which was a relatively new historical concept that we have in, the 17th, maybe 18th century, relatively new concept, people had to be careful of what they wrote. And indeed, even afterwards, people were careful about what they wrote. They assumed pseudonyms for authorship because they were afraid of persecution. And some people posit that you can even read certain rabbinic works as a kind of code. And I think there's some truth in it, because a lot of times when you study Talmud, you'll see it just goes on and on about a subject that seems completely inconsequential to any matter of existence in the universe. And then you'll come to some hidden gem, or if you know how to read Talmud in a certain way, you can even think that this mundane things is actually quite significant, but they're writing it in a certain kind of coded language that only a few people could decipher. And that was, other rabbis. Today we don't have that problem. And so think about that for a moment as we go through on the top of page 36. Ma'aseh b'Rabbi Eliezer v'Rabbi Yehoshua, v'Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, v'Rabbi Akiva, v'Rabbi Tarfon, shehayu mesubin b'nei vrak. So they were reclining, all these scholars When it says ma'aseh, it means it's a tale. We're on page 36, excuse me. Is everybody on page 36? Okay. We'll wait a second. Okay? So the very first paragraph at the top. So you have these rabbis, and they're sitting, reclining in Bnei Brak. Okay? And the Haggadah, I don't know when the Haggadah was finally put together, but we have to assume that it had to be at least as early as the 2nd century, at least some remnants of it from the 2nd century, from the 3rd century CE. Why? Because the Mishnah, of which the Haggadah incorporates a part, was written around 220 CE. So they had to have that text. So we're looking at a very early period of when the Haggadah begins to take shape. So these people are misubin, reclining, okay? And why do they recline? Because they're reclining because they are telling the story of the Exodus, and when you tell the story of the Exodus, you're supposed to recline. Why? Because reclining is the nature of kings. And we are to see ourselves as kings, as kind of rulers of our own destiny when we were liberated from Egypt. Now, the paradox of Judaism, and that's why you have to always say, is that 100% true, that we were like kings when we left Egypt? Yes, that's true, but if you get to a certain point, in this narrative talks about the Exodus was for a purpose. And the purpose of the Exodus was to be, quote, slaves to God and to have the freedom to worship and to do Torah, which was in the Roman rule, which is when this event was happening. And they were telling, okay, v'hayu misaprim b'tziat Mitzrayim kol oto halayla, and that they were telling of the exodus of Egypt the entire night. So these 5 rabbis who lived during the Roman occupation, and during the time possibly of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, which is between 132 and 135, where Rabbi Akiva declared Bar Kokhba to be the Messiah because he was a warrior. That's the historical context that's not mentioned here. Why isn't it mentioned here? Well, because probably by the time this is being written down, I mean, the Holy Roman Empire comes about in 300, and let's assume that after 300, you're not going to be able to talk about Roman revolt in your Haggadah. You just can't. That has to be left out. But you can talk about, because it's religion, you can talk about the exodus of Egypt. So if you know that Rabbi Akiva and you know that Rabbi Elazar was, all these 5 rabbis lived during the Roman occupation when it was forbidden to study Torah, when it's forbidden to teach Torah in public, and that Rabbi Akiva, we're going to find out, gets arrested, it's not in this story, gets arrested and is burned at the stake, okay, and according to Talmudic legend, the Shema was the very last words that he announced as the fire was consuming him. Then you have a deeper appreciation of symbolically of what this story is about. And they're not just simply telling of the exodus of Egypt, they're talking about a time of future liberation from Roman domination. Do you see that? I mean, that's an inference from what the text is talking about, okay? Why? Because they're telling the whole thing the entire night.
Isn't Rabbi Akiva often referenced that when you talk about Jewish revolts and the chance for Jewish freedom, isn't his name always prominent?
Yeah, well, yeah, he was politically involved. He would have been considered, I mean, it's not really a good analogy, but I'm going to make it anyway, but it's not that great of an analogy. He was the Abraham Joshua Heschel of his time.
Yes.
But, I mean, he was acting in defiance of Roman occupation, whereas Rabbi Heschel, alav shalom, may he rest in peace, didn't risk the kind of thing that Rabbi Akiva risked. Yes, he was involved in the march, and yes, he was a strong advocate for civil rights, and he's to be really commended for this. This is celebrating the Pesach kind of on pain of death. So they're doing this privately. עד שבאו תלמידיכם ואמרו לכם, רבותינו, הגיע זמן קריאת שמע של שחרית. Until their students came and said to them, our rabbis, the time for the recitation of the Shema of the morning has arisen. So some people infer from this, some scholars and some rabbis, traditional rabbis infer from this, that they weren't just discussing the exodus of Egypt, but they were also discussing what freedom meant and how to practice Torah in a time of enslavement. They compared Roman occupation to a certain level of slavery. And because you could not teach, after the Bar Kokhba rebellion, I believe, you could no longer teach Torah. There was a law against teaching Torah in public, among other decrees that the Romans enforced, because they didn't want revolution, they didn't want change, they wanted to stay in power. And that's kind of a lesson, no matter what generation,
People always think the resistance ended with the burning of the temple and the sack and Masada, but it was way after that too.
Yes, this is way after this is way after I don't know if it's way after what.
It's around 134.
Bar Kokhba is 132 to 135. That's it. Yeah, and he was going to. Yeah.
But people come and say, well, I'm seeing the Jewish rebellion.
Yeah.
The Romans had a lot of their hands.
Yeah, that's right. So, okay. So I just wanted to point that out, that the story of the Exodus and the discussion about freedom go hand in hand. In other words, it's not inappropriate, okay, to talk about the issues of our time, whether it's Israel, whether it's the United States, whether it's the world situation, whether it's Russia, the Ukraine, that the issue of freedom and enslavement are appropriate discussions at the Seder table. I think, this is my own feeling, this is my understanding of why this particular narrative is here, is because you have this as one of the central themes. Now this actually appears in a traditional Haggadah, appears right after the Halach Ma'anya. This is the bread of affliction and so forth. And so you have the juxtaposition of the Aramaic, this is the bread of affliction that our forefathers ate in Egypt. Right after that, then you have, you're moving up in time to this Ma'aseh, because how the rabbis act is a lesson for how, it's not true in all cases, but the sages, when they act in a certain way, are there to teach us something about how we're supposed to act. Okay? And this is, if you think about it, this is why in Judaism the idea of justice and what justice means and what freedom means is so widely discussed, and why you have this strong strain in Judaism of liberalism, of democracy, of concern for those who are oppressed. It comes from this kind of perspective. Now, we're living in, interesting times, and we have people that are all across the political spectrum, right? We're living in interesting times. And how we approach that, how we deal with that, has to at one time integrate our own value system and understanding that the world is different, but also that the world is somewhat, that the issues that the world grapples with today are not unlike the issues of previous generations. A good example, I just finished watching the Churchill documentary on Netflix. And there, a big issue for the United States, it wasn't really brought out, was the isolationist position of many Americans. The Germans didn't bomb Pearl Harbor. Why are we fighting the Germans? There was this, and before that, Roosevelt was very much afraid to get America involved in another world war. He didn't get involved until Japan was attacked, and that provided an opening to go against the Axis, to go against Germany as well as Japan. There's been this trend in every country to be somewhat protective of state interest. To what extent should our policies be influenced by self-preservation, and to what extent should our policies be influenced by the deep values that we hold dear? Democracy, freedom, the right to self-determination of a people. And in the real world, it's not black and white.
Well, Washington always said avoid foreign entanglements, and they took that to mean all from an isolation.
Yeah,
standpoint.
and the world is a changing place all the time. So, okay, so that's enough of that. Let's see where we're at the time-wise. Okay, what I want to do now is to build on what I just said. I want us to turn to, just very simply, I want us to turn to page 50 and 51. Page 51.
You said that there's 3 must-mentions at the Seder, and Passover was one. What were the other?
Matzah
Matzah.
and the maror,
The what?
the bitter herbs.
Thank you.
The Paschal Lamb has 2 important functions. The Paschal Lamb, it commemorates the passing over of God. And a very important principle we talked about, I think last time, was that in order for a miracle to occur, this is one of the lessons of a midrash, is that you have to participate in the miracle. The question, well, couldn't God distinguish between, the Jewish home and the non-Jewish, the Egyptians' home in killing of the firstborn? Of course, if God is omniscient, it's a rhetorical question, right? I mean, everybody knows that God could have. Using anthropomorphism for a moment. So why did the children of Israel have to put blood on their doorpost? It's because they had, for the miracle to occur, they had to participate in the miracle. And of course, that's the lesson, right? The lesson is that if you want good to happen, you have to participate. You have to be an active proponent of that. And the same thing with the crossing. You have that same narrative in the crossing of the Red Sea, which is part of the story of the Passover, was the sea parting, right? Well, when did the sea part? The sea parted was when Pinchas walked into the water and said he would rather die in the ocean, or die in the sea, rather than go back to Egypt. And as the water reached his chin, the sea parted. Of course, if the sea parted, he would have dropped, and probably would have been dead. But that part of the narrative is them joking a little bit. But the point that he's making is that for the miracle to occur, you have to believe in something greater than yourself. You have to be willing to even put your life on the line for the unexpected, for the unconventional thing to happen. I mean, that's what England did, right?
I'm so glad you said that, because I always wondered, why did the priest have to put their feet in the River Jordan before it was stopped up? And then everyone crossed over. And that explains that.
Yeah, there's that, there is that element of again, I'm going to use the Netflix documentary because that's kind of real. No one thought that Britain could hold off the Nazis. I mean, they were really in peril, the city being bombed and terrible. I mean, what they went through in 1940, I think it was, 1940, was absolutely horrendous. And the idea was that they would break the morale, and Britain's life hung in the balance. But because they resisted, because they believed in their destiny and their providence, so to speak, that they fought on and they held on. And it's that same idea that belief in your providence in some way will eventually lead to redemption. I mean, that's kind of the lesson, so to speak. Okay, so we see, but going back to 51, you see this you see the 10 plagues that are mentioned here, and in each plague you take a drop, dip your finger in the wine, and you spill a little bit. And that comes from the idea that human suffering is God's suffering. That is to say that we diminish our joy because we know that our joy and our liberation came at the expense of the suffering of the Egyptians, even though you could say justly that that the Egyptians deserved every bit of what they got. People get the leader. I believe this, and I've said this before. People get the leadership they want, and they get the leadership they deserve. In other words, if you may want something, you want something in a leader, you want the leader to take over and solve all your problems, well, that's going to come at a price. That's going to come with things that you could predict could happen that you may not necessarily be happy with. Okay? So people get the leadership they want, and they get the leadership that is a consequence of their decision. I won't take that any further. But we remember at the same time the suffering that the Egyptians had because of their recalcitrance, because of Pharaoh's recalcitrance in not letting the people go. And you can talk about, well, his heart was hardened by God and he couldn't, and so forth and so on. That's a whole different question. But the dropping of the wine, because wine is a symbol of joy, says that we acknowledge the human suffering that is involved. And in some ways that parallels the halach ma'anya. This is the bread of affliction, where we invite everybody, poor person, whoever needs to celebrate Passover, who's ever just hungry, let them come and eat. We identify on the night of Passover this notion of enslavement. Hashtachacha, now we are here, next year we'll be in a land where our self-determination, i.e. Israel, will be there. We still remain, despite having the land of Israel today, we still recite those words, that now we are slaves, next year we will be free, even though we are free. Yeah.
Is that where the next year in Jerusalem came?
Yep. Yeah, L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, yeah. Next year, because why? Because Jerusalem is the center, as it were. It's a very good question that raises. What is the difference? Why shouldn't it just say, why does it say L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim? And in the Halach Ma'anya, what's it say? Now we are here, I think next year, I think in the original text, I don't have the original text here, I think they may have actually changed it. Let's see. L'shana haba b'nei chori, next year, this year we are slaves, next year we will be free. B'nei chori meaning free people. I don't know in the other halach ma'anya whether it's been changed or whether it says b'nei chori, free people. We identify, in any event, we identify with the slave. Next year we hope to be free. Even though we're free, there's sort of a paradox. The only way that I can explain it is that we identify with the sufferer and we want something done about it. In other words, we don't want to be slaves. We don't want ourselves to be slaves, and we don't want others to be enslaved. And we know that freedom comes with a price. And that price is the suffering of others. The suffering of the oppressor, or of the people who have empowered the oppressor to oppress us, right? And so we diminish our joy a little bit by taking a droplet of wine. And so again, it's not without, now one can say, well, it's just a little thing, but all these little rituals mean something. And the problem is they don't get elaborated on at the Seder because, you want to get done, you want to eat, and you want to do all of that. And you don't want to listen to someone like me ramble on for an hour. You want to get to the food and so forth. And, people see these things as sort of a nice time for gathering, a nice time for a meal. And the joke is, well, when are we going to get to eat, and all of that. Another piece that is very, very important that I want to get to, let's see. Let's see.
So you have to mention 3 things during Passover?
Yeah,
Okay.
you have to mention the Pesach, the
Okay.
Paschal lamb that was offered in the temple.
As you're talking to people, or?
No, it's actually in the Haggadah. Let me see where it's at. No, it's actually in the Haggadah. Every Haggadah has it, even I won't say even, but as well, yeah, every Haggadah has it, and this one is no exception. They go a little bit out of order here. Let's see. I'm sorry, I should have had this. Oh, here, bottom of page 53. Mm-hmm. Okay? You can see here, Rabban Gamliel would say, whoever does not, this is right out of the Mishnah, meaning a writing that was done by 220 CE after the destruction of the Second Temple. Okay, so this is part of the. They cite Psachim, which is a Talmudic. If you go to the Talmud that deals with Passover, and you go to chapter, if you go to the Mishnah, Mishnah chapter 10, Mishnah number 5, this is where you'll find it. Okay. And I could get the book, but there's no point. It would just take too much time. So he says there's 3 things. One is the Pesach, which is, you can see on page 55. What's the reason for it? That the Holy One, blessed be He, passed over the houses of the children of Israel and smote Benogpo and smote the Egyptians, even though that's not the translation. Let's see. Yeah, the Pesach Shayu Ochlin that we eat, that our ancestors ate at the time of the Beit HaMikdash was standing. What is he referring to? He's referring to the time when the children of Israel, there was a temple standing, and they had the right to self-determination. They, quote, own, close quote, Israel. They had to pay a tax, right? They had to pay a tribute to Rome, right? They had to pay tribute, but they still could practice their religion, they could still bring offerings, and they had a certain element of freedom. So Rabban Gamliel, who lived after, I believe, after the destruction of the Second Temple, he created this to make a reference to 2 things. At the time of the temple, people would bring what's called the Korban Pesach, which they were required to do, the Paschal offering, the lamb, then they would eat it. People think, well, they just slaughtered the lamb and they burned it and that was the end of the animal. No, they actually ate it, okay? And that was a mitzvah, that was a commandment. And then there was the other piece of it, which was the Pesach, the original Korban Pesach, where the children of Israel slaughtered the lamb, took the blood and put it on the doorpost. And so it had 2 pieces to it. One was the liberation, and one was a time of when they were truly, quote, liberated by God fulfilling the promise that the Israelites would have their own homeland, which they didn't have after the destruction of the Second Temple. So that's why, again, he brings, I think, why he brings this. Because, so let me explain why this is important. Like, you're not going to get this at the Seder table, and you're not going to go into it at the Seder table. This is for your own enrichment of understanding what's going on here and why it's important to understand what makes up the Jewish soul. I mean, what makes us up? So what you have in Rabban Gamliel is the following. Up through Julius Wellhausen, who put together the JEPD, Torah was written over a long period of time, in different sections, and blah, 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 blah. In Rabbinic Judaism, it was determined that God gave the Torah to Moses at Mount Sinai, and also gave how it was to be understood. Okay? How was the Torah to be understood? How were the laws to be understood? There was this oral Torah that was given. We've talked about this earlier. This way, it's all kind of one cake, right? So, when we come to this Mishnah, right? How could God have told Moses? Now you could say, well, this was like Midrashic, and Moses, God said in 70 CE, this is going to happen, and so forth and so on. Or you can take, I think, an even stronger theological view, which is Rabban Gamliel is saying that we have to remember the time that we are free, and that it is a mitzvah, it is a commandment to remember that time. And for them, you see, it was what God had required, because they believed that this was the Word of God. And they weren't willing to give up their belief in God based on what they saw, based on what was happening in their life. They continued to hold on to it regardless. Now I'm going to get a little political and have to excuse me here, because it just kind of happened. And it's something that's always on my mind, and that is Messianic Jewry. I find that to be a complete insensitivity towards Jews. I don't mind Christians practicing Jewish rituals. That's perfectly fine. If you believe in Jesus and you want to do all the commandments, that's absolutely fine. But Judaism, for the longest time, has rejected the idea that Jesus was the Messiah. We could be wrong, okay? I can say we could be wrong. I don't know, But I certainly respect those people who do believe. And I demonstrate that by my actions, right? I mean, I have great respect for Christianity and what Christianity teaches and so forth. I have great respect for that, But we both me and my two pastors that I work with, we understand what the dividing line is. We understand they would never have me read during an interfaith service a prayer that invoked Jesus. They're not just because they're not being rude, but they know that for me to recite those words would not be appropriate. It wouldn't be appropriate for the parishioners, and it wouldn't be appropriate for me. It doesn't mean that I don't respect Christianity. If they want to call themselves, but people have died over generations and generations of time affirming, and you see it here with Rabban Gamliel saying, we want to remember what took place before. And we are resisting, as a form of resistance, this kind of forgetting of who we once were. It's not just about the temple. It's not just about the Pesach, the Paschal offering that they did in the temple. It's about our identity. And when people appropriate the essence of who we are and link it to something that we're not, we are not Christians. We are Jews, and Jews believe in God, and they don't believe in Jesus. Now, if they want to call themselves Christians, which I would respect completely, and they want to say we're Christians practicing Jewish rituals, we're incorporating all these Jewish rituals, all these holidays into Christianity, I have no difficulty with it. It's a free country. People want to create whatever they want to create that's meaningful for them. That's all fine. But to call themselves Messianic Jews is not in keeping with history, and it is problematic in terms of you know of sensitivity about the Jewish people. I mean, it's that, you know, it's not quote right, you know. It would be just as inappropriate for us to adopt a Christian ritual or whatever, and yet deny at the same time the existence of Jesus. I'm trying to find a parallel, I can't, but it's not appropriate.
You're not offending us at all,
Yeah.
because we understand
Yeah,
it's called tolerance.
and yeah, and I mean, that's what our country's about, isn't it? We're supposed to be about, and then I think it is for the, you know.
Yeah, but
Oh,
we understand what you're talking about.
yeah. Thank you. So, and the matzah is to remember the haste in which we moved out from Egypt. That are not about the bread, you know, they could have waited another 18 minutes. But the point is, there are two things. One, I've heard this wonderful midrash that the reason why we have matzah, there's also a deeper reason for that. And the deeper reason is that yeast puffs up the bread, right? And on Passover, we are to feel a certain level of humility, that our souls should not be puffed up. The food that we eat should not be inflated. It should promote a sense of humility, which, you know, I don't know whether people think of it that way. And then the last one is that, in other words, it should promote a sense of, I've said it before, humility. And finally, you have the maror, the bitter herb, to remember the bitterness of slavery. We should never forget the bitterness of slavery in how we treat other people. You know, that we are never to enslave. Why? Because we know what slavery was like. Now, you know, you're saying, well, you know, that was so long ago, and that's the whole point of the Seder, is to not forget. To try not to forget that visceral feeling. And that's promoted in the text, where it says that in every generation, I gotta find it here, let's see if I can find it. To go for a minute here, just bear with me. I don't know why I can't find it. There is a section in the Haggadah that says, you kind of go a little bit out of order, so I get a little bit mixed up here. That it's obligatory for everyone to see themselves as if they too were slaves in Egypt. In other words, I don't know, it's in here and I'm just fumbling around trying to find it. Well, here it is. Page 56. I apologize for taking that amount of time. Okay. So on page 56, and right in about 1/3 of the line down, it says, in every generation. B'chol dor v'dor, in each and every generation, chayav adam, a person, adam, which is interesting that they use that word, adam meaning a human being, okay, is obligated, le'ot et atzmo, to see himself or herself, ki ilu hu yatsa b'mitzrayim, as if he went forth from Egypt. V'shenema, so what's the proof for that? They always have to have a proof text. How do we discern that principle from the Torah? So he garata levincha bayoma hu lemor. You shall tell your child on that day, be'avor zeh asa Adonai li b'tzeiti mimitzrayim. For this reason, or for this sake, or because of this, God did this for me in bringing me forth from Egypt. In other words, I see myself as if I am a slave and that there's a personal redemption element here that the Seder is supposed to bring out. It's not just simply a ritual that people gather and say, when do we get to the food? There is supposed to be, in some sense, turning the Seder into something more than a ritual, to turning it into something that is a personal commitment or a personal experience of the slavery-freedom dichotomy. I mean, that's kind of the point when you get to it. And all these rituals are just designed to help the person do that. Okay. One last thing that I want to bring out, and this is where it gets and that's the cup of Elijah, which is towards the end of the Seder. Okay?
Page 68.
Yeah, in fact, they've left it out altogether. I'm not surprised. Let's see, they left it out altogether here.
This was
Yeah, it's not in here. Yeah, so let me see, maybe it's in this one. And this is often left out. Do you all know about the cup of Elijah at the Seder?
That's not the same thing as having the empty seat and going and opening the door for.
Yes, that's it. Okay.
For him to come in.
Right.
Elijah to come back.
It's not in this one either. They took it out.
It
Okay.
says, legend has it that Elijah returns to earth from time to time to defend the helpless.
Yep,
Is it on page 68?
Yeah.
It says the cup of Elijah?
yep. It is about the Messianic era. But by the way, Maimonides or someone makes the point that even at the time of the coming of the Messiah or the Messianic era, the Passover will still be observed. In fact, Maimonides goes so to say all of mitzvahs are going to, nothing of the natural order of things are going to change when the Messianic era comes. We will still be obligated. Some say that the Passover will still be observed.
What was the Messianic era? From what day to what day? Or is there...
Yeah, so there is no date. In fact, we're not supposed to speculate on the coming of the Messianic era. The Messianic era, I'm a kind of Maimonidean, okay? So there are other people in the tradition who might hold differently, but I find his attitude to be most satisfying from my own perspective. And he says a person shouldn't speculate as to when the Messianic era is to come. We should approach it as if when it comes, it comes. We shouldn't look at historical events as a signal of the coming of the Messianic era. We shouldn't interpret events as leading towards the Messianic era. And there's good reason for that, by the way. From a Jewish point of view, Shabtai Tzvi declared himself to be the Messiah. And he got people who lived in very, very difficult circumstances in Europe during his time, which is the 16th, maybe early 17th century. And he had quite a following. He was not just someone who was known in his little circle. He went throughout Europe, and people got very worked up when he came because he declared himself, and I guess Nathan the prophet declared him to be the Messiah. So he got everybody all kind of worked up. And then he decided to make pilgrimage to Israel. He stopped in Turkey. They took some exception to rabble-rousers like him. They arrested him on the spot when he ported in Istanbul, I believe. And the Sultan or the Imam, whoever was in charge of the Ottoman Empire at the time, said, either convert to Islam or prove yourself to be the Messiah and we'll try to put you to death. Well, being not wanting to gamble that maybe he wasn't the Messiah, he converted to Islam. Well, you can just imagine the disappointment and the nature of being so upset. You know, here's a man who had aroused everyone's hope and fervor that liberation was going to come from their very difficult life circumstances during the 15th century as a Jew, living in the European age, and living in Europe and living in Eastern Europe. I mean, it just wasn't pleasant, despite what you might see in Fiddler on the Roof. It wasn't. It was a very hard life, and to keep the faith, to keep Judaism alive, was no small accomplishment. And the disappointment. So Maimonides was absolutely correct, I think, from a psychological point of view. When the Messiah comes, the Messiah will come. But we really shouldn't focus our energies, nor interpret historical events as a coming of the Messiah. Now I know that, that there are evangelical Christians, and they're not bound by Maimonides' teaching, and they see Israel, the establishment of the state of Israel, as the first step towards the second coming of the Messiah. And I think Israel is very grateful for that support. I mean, it's important because evangelical Christians have enormous political influence, and they're very grateful. But it comes from that, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, it comes from that perspective that the establishment of the state of Israel and the inward bringing of Jews to Israel is a requisite step towards the coming of the Messianic era, the second coming, excuse me.
It's one of the prophecies that
Right.
had to happen.
Yep. Look at in our liturgy,
Israel has to exist.
in our liturgy, every day, there is that Tekabeh shofar gadol lecherutenu. Sound the shofar, tekabeh shofar, the sounding of the great shofar lecherutenu for our freedom. Tekabeh shofar lecherutenu. V'sonnet lekabetz galiotenu. And please gather us from our exile. V'kabtzenu yachad me'arba kanfot ha'aretz. And gather us from the four corners of the earth. Who will gather our people, Israel, from the four corners of the earth and bring them to Israel. That's said every day by traditional Jews. And, you look at the establishment of the state of Israel, some people interpret that as the first step. In Judaism, in classical Judaism at least, in my view, is that we really should when the Messiah will come, when the Messiah will come. But as I heard from the Israeli consulate general once, when they asked him about this phenomenon of evangelical Christian support, he said, well, we'll worry about that when it happens. But right now, we need, and that's a very pragmatic and we're very grateful for that support. We're very grateful for that support because we need that support.
Are you in favor of Huckabee being the ambassador?
What's that?
Are you in favor of Huckabee being the ambassador, Governor Huckabee?
Well, I think there's a little bit, where I get torn a little bit, is that while I recognize and acknowledge the importance of a land to call our own, and my Zionism comes from the Herzl's vision of Zionism, which is different, a little bit different from biblical Zionism. It's a little bit different. In biblical Zionism, I think you look at the return as a sign of the Messianic era. Herzl Zionism was a political Zionism, and while it played on those people that longed for return, it played more on how difficult the circumstances were in the Talmud. Now that goes against, Herzl went against, 1,500 years, minimum of 1,500 years of tradition. In the Talmud it says that we should not engage in dochek ataketz. Dochek ataketz means forcing the end. We shouldn't force the end of times. We shouldn't make the times come faster. We don't have that. In opposition to Herzl, in the more conservative Orthodox movement, less so in conservative and Reform, and Reform had its opposition for different reasons initially. It came around into support, and Abba Hillel Silver, Louis Brandeis made the argument about political Zionism. But Dochek HaTaketz says it's only for God to bring back the children of Israel, and that we should not engage in any activity that forces the end. Now,
I've heard Herzl described as more nationalistic.
Yeah, peoplehood, yeah. Yeah, the right of self-determination.
Right.
Absolutely. I mean, he was willing to consider Uganda as a possible place. As a possible place. And the reason I think he thought that, at least I've read this, and I can't cite the source, again, this is being recorded, it's going to be posted on YouTube, he's, some people claim that he could foresee that the situation in Eastern Europe was untenable, that it was growing more and more desperate as time went on.
He wrote about that.
Yeah. So he was a visionary. I mean, he didn't foresee Hitler, but he saw situations become.
He saw somebody like Hitler.
Did he? Yeah. And so he saw the situation becoming more and more desperate. But the problem with Uganda was, we didn't pray for the return to Uganda. That wasn't in our blood, so to speak. What was in our blood was a return to Israel. The prayers all reflect that. The prayers reflect redemption being a return to Israel. And that is, in fact, what the Passover is in part all about. It's about the right of... Now, the Elijah the prophet, and I'll send you the original text that went with that. When something was from Isaiah, you might know this, that begins, pour out thy wrath upon the nations. Does any verse from Isaiah, pour out thy wrath upon the nations that have mistreated Israel, and do unto them. I'm really paraphrasing, I don't know the exact quote.
Isaiah's really big.
Yeah, but
It's in the first, I think it's in the first half of Isaiah.
Oh, well, that's a lot too.
I think it was written by the first Isaiah.
yeah, pour out thy wrath. And the reason, right, yeah, the reason for that verse on Eliyahu the prophet was that there was, just like the Egyptians enslaved us, that, don't forget, we're talking about the hope for a redemption. We're hoping for the right of freedom. L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. Okay? You're talking about a return to a Jewish, loosely stated Jewish people, or what we would say today, the right of our people for self-determination, as any group has a right to self-determination. But that was always to be done by God, the people who composed this. And they saw, and maybe because they saw themselves as being powerless, and then we're going to stop because I know I'm over time, so they, in time of the Messianic era, at the very end, they said, pour out thy wrath upon the nations that have mistreated Israel, and do unto them. It's a very violent,
Psalm 79:6.
Do you have it?
79, a psalm says it.
Yeah, it's in Isaiah, I'm positive. But I'll send it to you. I think it's Isaiah.
Pour my spirit upon your... Is Isaiah?
Yeah, it is, it'd be in Isaiah, pour out thy wrath. But anyway, that, as you can see in the more contemporary Haggadot, that has been taken out. for lots of different reasons. Maybe in part because of the universalism of Passover and the notion of a retribution by God, or praying for retribution to punish those nations that have mistreated the Jewish people, as a parallel to Egyptian was not something that was favored. So I just want to conclude this this presentation with just when you celebrate the Passover, that think about what's the deeper meaning here, and it should inspire us to understand the importance of freedom, even when we are free, to try to remember or imagine what it was like to not be so free, and to treasure that. It's very interesting, in the Churchill documentary, I think it was David Brinkley, the historian, who said, at that time democracy was hanging on by a thread. And I would venture to say that it's always like that in every generation, that freedom, the right of self-determination, the right of people to be free and to live their lives in accordance with their tenets and belief, that always hangs on the thread. And I think the Haggadah, in part, not the whole story, represents that value. And that's something that we are to feel in a deep way as we live our lives. Well, thank you all for coming, and we'll, as my teacher would say, we'll stop here. Okay.
I've heard it said that matzah was also